Thank you for attending the next event that is part of International Studies Day. The panel discussion is called Research with International Focus Pursued by SIE Faculty. Several faculty affiliates of the International Studies program at SIE will provide information on their research projects with international focus and global impact. So first we'll hear Carolina Rocha, professor in the Foreign Languages and Literature Department. She's also the director of the Women's Studies program.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here today. It's a wonderful day outside. But I am excited to be talking about my research about Latin America. And since I have been here at SIUE, I have been doing research in Latin American literature and cinema. So let me start with...
So I told you this software is not responsive.
That's okay.
The only method that I use.
Improvise. Not...
Yeah, it looks like the only method that works with this system is to get out of the presentation mode and then just go down by
one by one.
No, it's not working. How is it possible? Press again. Wow.
Those are sumadas.
You can just close that.
Okay.
See.
If this doesn't work, maybe we should try Does it work?
There,
Works.
great. So, my first research book was, and I am going to be making 2 points during my presentation. First, that I am focusing on Latin America, but throughout my research time, I have developed ties and worked collaboratively with people in other countries and continents to produce my research. And I have also gone to different countries, for instance, Germany, to research about Latin America. So I started with my first collected volume in which I work with a colleague from a university in Australia. We published this about Argentine cultural production. And at that time, I was researching Latin American literature. So here we took the focus of a rebellion that happened in 2001 in Latin America because neoliberalism was introduced in Argentina, and it meant a lot of socioeconomic changes, and people reacted. So we chose this picture, which means we want all the politicians to leave. It was a time of upheaval and social change, and we wanted to capture how the arts reacted to those political changes. Then I went to a conference in Canada, and while taking a look at all the panels that were there, I saw that most of the presentations were going to be about Argentine literature and culture, but with a focus on violence. And I said, this is so amazing that while having lunch with a colleague who works at the University of Calgary, I said, we have to put together some of these presentations into a volume, and that's how this collective volume was emerged, and it was published in 2010. But the landmark of a career, academic careers, is having your own monograph. So I was having this idea to research masculinities in contemporary Argentine cinema. When we talk about masculinities, we talk about gender, how gender is performed and understood in different societies. And I have to go back to the first slide because I also wanted to see how those socioeconomic changes impacted men and their representation in cinema. We usually tend to think of Latin American men as macho men, but there was a switch in these years, and my first book investigated those changes. And while I was writing the first book, I realized that the Argentine state passed some laws about how to subsidize films. Because here in the US we have private investors investing in making films. But this is very original, and in most countries in the world, the state has to subsidize the production of films. So we talked with my colleague and we came out with this collected volume. My colleague works at the University of Utah. And so we investigated the changes that Argentine and Brazilian cinema experienced in the 1990s. Once again, during those times of globalization. But when I was working on this collected volume, I kept thinking about masculinities. And I said, my book about masculinities is probably the second one. The first one was done by an anthropologist who migrated from Argentina to Norway. Then he passed away really young. He examined the masculinities in soccer, polo, and another sport, and tango. But he died very young, so his obra is contained. So I decided to write about modern Argentine masculinities. And this is also a collective volume that allows me to trace the history of masculinities from the 19th century to the 21st century. And we examine masculinities in literature, in films, in songs, in playwrights. And so the artist here did a wonderful job, because here we have the gaucho figure, and then famous writers, and then we have two men trying to dance tango, which tango originated in Argentina, but then it went to Paris and it was rediscovered in Argentina once it succeeded in France. At the same time that I was working on this volume, we started conversation with someone who was a colleague, a classmate in graduate school. We started talking about the representation of children in Argentina, in Latin America, and Spanish filmmaking. And we saw that there were a lot of films coming out in the early 21st century that had child protagonists, yet they were addressing an audience for adult viewers. So we decided to take a look at why filmmakers choose to, for instance, revisit traumatic periods in times through the lenses of young characters, either children or adolescents. So this book came about in 1012. But we were so successful with this book that we have seconds. And then this is how screening minors in Latin American cinema came to be. When we were working in these two volumes, we used the theory and the framework from feminist theory applied to cinema. Mainly, what happens to the spectators when they see young characters? What are the limitations? Can we see young children naked, for instance? What are the problems? And so this started a field of examining the representation of young characters in cinema. At the same time, I was thinking, well, there's a lot of research being done on Argentine cinema in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but I would like to examine what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. And this is a book that blends and examines those topics. Now, at the beginning of my presentation, I said that I was going to tell you how I did research about Latin America, for instance, in Germany. And international studies is the guilty party here, because I started teaching international studies. I started teaching about World War II, Berlin, after World War II, and so I decided to examine how Latin American cinema was screened in the Berlin Film Festival. So knowing only 5 words in German, I went to Berlin to do research about Brazilian cinema at the Berlin Film Festival. And so that brings me to my first lab, which is neoliberalism in Latin America. I was very diligently working on my research when one of my colleagues from Australia tells me, you know what, I have so many abstracts, so many participations, but I need a co-editor. Do you want to come aboard? And so that's how contemporary Latin American cinema came out in 2018. We re-examine the changes that happened in Latin America. Finally, I would like to mention 2 things. While I specialize mainly on Argentine literature and film, I have also done research in Colombia, and this is one of my most cited articles because it examines the production of a company, Colombian company, and how they make films. I have also written about Uruguayan cinema. Uruguay, it's a small country in Latin America, and we have a very talented filmmaker who has done 3 movies in Uruguay with financing from other countries. And this is what I am doing in these days. I am going back to literature, so I am researching about crime novels by this author, Claudia Piñero. Thank you so much for your attention and allowing me to show you my research.
Okay, we will listen next to Professor Suman Mishra from Mass Communications, talking about researching India, globalization, media, and social change.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about me and my research. So I'm Suman Mishra. I'm a professor in the Department of Mass Communications. I'm also the graduate program director. So probably you can guess that I am from India.
No.
So I was born in India. And in 2001, I came to the US to do my studies, to do my master's here, and then I moved on to do my PhD here. And so since then, I have traveled these 2 worlds, the country that I was born in and the country that I have adopted, right? So stayed in. And so I always kind of find it very fascinating every time I go back to India to see the changes that are taking place. And every few years that I go, I see this massive change in India, and I'm always kind of fascinated with what is happening and why it is happening and all those things. So from that place, I kind of come from in terms of my research. I'm absolutely curious about how globalization shapes society and culture, and the changes that have taken place in India over a period of time. And most of my work, I kind of talk about from colonization to the present time and how those shifts have taken place. And so researching India is the title of my presentation. Probably I can also say that it should be re-hyphenated Searching India, because India has changed so much. So I would like to kind of talk about that. In today's presentation, I will only focus on a few of my articles and few of my research work, and I've done a lot of work both here in the US and in India. So I'm just going to focus on what I've done in India. So this is where Dr. Rota's and my work overlaps. So I also study masculinities. But I kind of focus it from, again, I look at, as I said, globalization and the shifts that have taken place. So one of my articles is called Globalizing Male Attractiveness, Advertising in Men's Lifestyle Magazine in India. I should also tell you that my training is in advertising and strategic communication, and I also do study cultures. So I bring these two together in my work. So in this particular study, I look at, through the study, I kind of reveal new models of masculinities that are circulated in Indian advertising through transnational men's lifestyle magazines, such as Men's Health, Maxim, GQ, which are prominent here, but they are also in the rest of the world. So I show how certain kind of Western masculine ideals and body aesthetics are being adopted and reworked to appeal and facilitate consumption among middle and upper class Indian men. The contemporary construction of masculinity today is that of hypermasculinity, so the six-pack, eight-pack abs, which was never a thing in India, but that has become very prominent. You also see male models who are of much fairer skin, though most Indians are not that fair, right? So fairer skin and whiteness, and there is also this view of self, male self, as global ethnic rather than Indian. So we also see that construction of masculinity in that way. So I argue in my research article that this construction helps to globalize or homogenize the male body and masculine ideals, while also privileging whiteness and class in both the global and the local arena. So this is one of the studies, and I've done several studies on masculinity. The other study that I did was on the Me Too movement. And I was kind of curious to see how, hashtag which starts here in one country, how does it go to another country? And how does it get adopted and become a thing in another country? So I studied the Me Too movement, which became a global Me Too movement, but I focused on India. So in this particular article, I examine how the global news stories are turned into local news stories through the process of what is called news domestication. I analyzed the press coverage of the global Me Too movement in Indian, 5 prominent English language newspapers in India. My findings show that the Indian press domesticated the global Me Too movement by highlighting similar concerns in the Indian entertainment industry, particularly Bollywood. It also filtered the stories through the local media logic as well as cultural logic in how it selected the stories to talk about. While this helped to raise the issue of sexual harassment among educated middle-class Indian men, it also trivialized it by focusing on celebrity scandals and ignoring the problems faced by ordinary or less organized women in marginalized communities. And in this particular article, I also deal with how the Indian press, since it's it is private, but there is so much focus on money making, and so how the stories, the type of stories which are getting told, is very, very commercial. Right? So that this article also kind of talks about that too. So I am interested in gender issues, as you can see, so masculinities and feminities and the construction of this, right? So my next article focuses on Bollywood. which is the Hindi film industry in India, which produces one of the largest number of films in the world. So in this study, which is called Misogyny and Erotic Pleasure in Bollywood's Item Numbers, I discuss the proliferation of specific kind of song and dance sequence in Bollywood, which are called item numbers, colloquially called item numbers. I show the shift from sensual depiction to now more pornographic depiction in these item numbers. I reveal how women are objectified in these titillating song and dance sequence through a very specific kind of visual vocabulary. So sexual objectification of women takes place through women's insignificant appearance in the movie as in the form of cameo roles, their placement at the center of a group of lusting or ogling men, as you can see in that image, revealing outfits and camera angles that focus on women's fragmented body parts, and the use of natural elements such as mud, water, fire surrounding women's body. So that is the visual language that is often used, so you can see this, right? So these are few articles which focus on gender. And I'll talk about my next two articles, which are more in the strategic communication and advertising area. So this particular article, which is the importance of consumer type in the attribution of crisis responsibility, I look at the case study of Maggi noodle crisis in India. So this was a major case in India where there was rumor that there was lead in Maggi noodles, and mothers and everybody else were very concerned because a lot of children like to eat Maggi noodles, and that is the target group. And so I wanted to kind of study the crisis in India. So most of the times in crisis communication, the focus is on crisis type. So what is the crisis type, and then what should one do? And so I wanted to focus on the consumer side, so I wanted to look at how mothers reacted. So that is what my study was. So in this particular study, through this study, I revealed that there are three types of customers who I categorize as devotees who are very brand loyal, there are doubters who are skeptics, and there are people who want to, just with slightest thing would want to drop out. So these people had very different perception of the crisis, the way they looked at the crisis, and they attributed very different levels of responsibility to the corporation based on their attitude towards brand, attitude towards corporation, attitudes towards regulatory institutions in India, as well as their level of nationalism. So the more nationalistic they were, the more they would criticize the Maggi noodles because Nestle is a Swiss company, a foreign company, and so thereby that itself is a problem, right? So this is another of my studies. And the last study, and this is basically an ongoing study, I should say. So lately I have got very interested in this topic of spirituality in the media, spirituality and marketization of spirituality. So I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about spirituality, which is the secularized form of religion, and how that is being kind of talked about in the media, how that is being popularized. So I'm doing several studies on this, and I'll just kind of talk about from the topic itself. You can see I'm looking at how spirituality is incorporated in branding, and so I'm looking at branding in a faith-based market. So that is there. Another study that I'm doing is, I've called it Mystical Moments on Instagram, how Indian spiritual gurus communicate and connect with global audiences. So there are specific strategies that they are using to connect with different audiences. The other is, again, a marketization of Hindu religion and spirituality in the East and West, which of course also includes yoga, which has been completely removed from religion, and everybody has adopted it as a secular thing about health and wellness. But it is very deeply entrenched as part of the religion too. But now, of course, So I can also talk about globalization of yoga in this case. So how it has transformed from being this part of the religion to now this global consumption for health and fitness. So that shift has also taken place. And not only has that shift taken place here in the US, actually that shift has also taken place in India. So we talk about like the return back of yoga. So yoga came from India to Western world, and now it has gone back and it has re-energized the Indians in adopting yoga even more. And so it is a kind of a fascinating look at how things change in this global world. So that is my few of my research work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I made a mistake of not asking you if you had any questions for Carolina Rocha, but she was in a hurry because she was teaching a class. I know that Sumani is in a hurry also for her class.
I can answer a few
but
questions.
Do you have any questions for her?
I have a question. I'm really interested in the mystical moments on Instagram. That just seems like a fascinating topic. What are, can you recommend some feeds to look at?
Oh, I can. So right now I'm only studying the Indian gurus right now, but there are a whole lot of people who are doing that. So there are new age gurus. So this is from the 1970s era type of gurus, and also we have now the modern gurus who call themselves life coach.
Mm-hmm.
So they are also kind of talking about spirituality, so that you will see a lot of people who call themselves life coach, but they are doing the same thing that the gurus did. And so it's kind of fascinating how they, in this particular one, I'm looking at how they kind of create authority, but also what do they talk about when they are talking about spirituality? Because as I said, it's not about religion. So what are they really talking about when they talk about spirituality? And so that's one of the type of study. Did I answer your question? Yes,
Yeah.
I do have examples.
Yeah, I was going through my feed on TikTok, and Krishnamurti always is popping up, but then all the ones that are kind of like mocking. So there's the ones that are sarcastic, that are deliberately playing that with kind of wink wink, like this really isn't authentic.
Yes,
and
yes.
it's farce.
Yes. So it is a kind of an interesting thing, because one can talk about Instagram is also kind of full of a lot of superficial things, right, and a lot of negative things too. So all these people who are at least sending positive messages, one can always criticize, right? One can be critical about, okay, why the self-help gurus, right?
Why are they relevant?
Why are they relevant? So one of my arguments is, well, at least they are putting out positive messages, right? Take care of yourself, think about this or that, right? So it's one voice in this kind of big media ecosystem.
I wanted to ask you because Tom mentioned Instagram and you mentioned, or he also mentioned TikTok. TikTok. But I heard on NPR a few years ago, quite a few years ago, maybe 8 years ago, about this battle in India because of this ultra-nationalistic movement in the past 10 years, especially under Narendra Modi. They were resistant to TikTok because they didn't want to lose business to China. So they invented the TikTok, right?
Probably, and I don't know about TikTok.
So people were talking at that moment like they are afraid now in the United States that they might lose business because, like a guru like that, they might have a lot of videos through which they were making money.
So actually it is also interesting. So the Indian gurus don't ask for money, direct money. And so one thing that separates a lot of kind of religion, especially from Christianity to others, they are also kind of, I should talk about copying the televangelists here, which is a separate study, can be a separate study. But in Hinduism, there is no conversion, okay? So because there isn't that, so what is the goal of these people being there, they are also not asking for money to donate. So they are also not trying to convert people. So why are they there, right? So why are they? And they have millions of followers. And so there is also this kind of need. So why are so many people following them, right? And this is global. And so it's, of course, largely Indian, so, but it's also global, so why are people following them? So, and part of it is that message, right? So I kind of also talk about that it is kind of a validation, right, for people, especially when they are going through a crisis or a tough day. When you see a message like that, that you have the control, you can change it, these are the things that you can do, it acts as a validation for people. Even if it is momentarily.
So how come are they so successful sometimes? Or there were periods of time, right? They were up and up in the time of, the Beatles.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then it went down. Now it's coming back.
They have always been very popular in India, right? So of course you have the celebrity gurus where you have very popular celebrities who follow them. So the gurus that I study, they are still very popular, and they have like Hollywood actors who follow them. So if you see, so there are Will Smith and others who very much follow them. So
I remember the experience that the main actress had in Love, Eat, Pray, right?
Yes.
With her Indian face.
Yes. So yes, so this is an ongoing research. I'm still working on it. So yes.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
I would like to ask you about the research that you presented to us regarding Maggi noodles. You mentioned that there are three types of consumers. If you could tell us some more about the methodology of research.
Okay, sure. Thank you for asking that question. So I did interviews with mothers. Because they are the primary purchasers of Maggi for their kids, and so I asked them different types of questions, and I wanted to see after this kind of lead being found or the rumor, would they be willing to buy Maggi noodles? And so this is where depending on their answers, I kind of categorized them into these groups. So there were people who were absolutely brand loyal. So they say, okay, there is a problem, but it'll be fine, right? And no, so we'll continue to buy. But there are people who were, and again, the level of nationalism really matters. So women who were more nationalistic would, kind of be more negative, and they would say like this is unhealthy food, and it is being, promoted to our children, to us. So they would kind of make that kind of argument. So I basically categorized them in order to kind of, write up my answers. So.
And which kind of variables you consider that are most important when you select it to categorize this kind of consumers?
So attitude towards brand was important. Nationalism was important. I can tell you the variables.
No. Okay.
Yes. So those kind of things. So attitude towards Nestle itself, the company, and how the people perceived it to be, like reliable or not, right? So whether it's a good corporation, does good for the society type of thing. So those were all variables.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I have one. So I was most interested in your section about kind of the rebound of yoga.
Yes.
From here and back to India. So I've never really heard of an example of like, kind of a globalizing of something here, and then that globalization goes back home. But the question is, so you said that when it came back to India, it kind of energized people about yoga again. So when it returned, do you mean to say that it kind of brought back, how do I word this? I'm sorry. So is secular yoga kind of the thing now, or did it kind of bring back a resurgence of the religious, spiritual side of it?
Both.
Both, okay.
Yes. So the thing that, not that it had ever left,
Mhm.
right? But that movement more popular, as it became very popular in the West, it was always there, but once it became very popular in the West, people, it was almost like a Western stamp of approval for something that, okay, this cultural tradition that we have, everybody's adopting, then they have this kind of benefit, and so it was this kind of, we need to kind of get back to it. And of course, Prime Minister Modi was also very much kind of involved in kind of making yoga as a national day. There were a lot of gurus, television gurus, televangelists, who were doing this mass camps for yoga. And so it kind of, again, re-energized that. Okay, thank you for
Thank you
listening
so
to my
much.
presentation.
Okay, we will move on next to Tom LaValle, Associate Professor in the Foreign Languages and Literature Department, with the topic Reflection on Travel to Hubei Province in China.
I think I have a PDF, so my navigation,
So you should go down page by page.
all right.
With the mouse or with the arrow.
So, let me introduce myself. My name is Tom LaValle. I'm in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature. I started to teach here at SIUE in 2001. I teach Chinese language and culture, and just a little bit about my background in terms of my training. When I was an undergrad, I was an English major. I wrote poetry. I was someone that wanted to learn how to translate. That was kind of the point of entry where I started to learn a little bit of Japanese. Realized that Japanese wasn't my thing, so I then switched to Chinese, and I had some really, really excellent teachers when I was an undergrad. Kind of laid the foundation for me to start learning Chinese. I finished my degree in English literature, went to Taiwan and lived for about a year and a half, taught English, learned Chinese, did a second degree when I returned to the US, and did a degree in Chinese language. I've always liked literature, liked poetry, so I kind of made the PhD level research and training as focused on ancient Chinese literature, and did a PhD at Washington University, which I completed in 2004. That's a little bit of my background. I'm going to talk today about divination. I'm also going to be very focused on a particular experience that I had, so I don't have a very long and broad experience with this topic, divination, but I guess it's going on five years now. But I wanted to share a little bit about how I became interested in this particular topic, some of the issues that I encountered when I was doing sabbatical work in China. There's a map. So my research was dedicated to the province of Hubei, Hubeishan. And if you can see in this map here, you've got, it's an inland. Usually Hubei is thought of as a second tier location. Most people, when you're looking at China and you're looking at it as it is developing, a lot of the development happens on the east coast and then kind of marches into the interior. So there's a lot of places in the interior of China that have not received as much study, in-depth study. So I thought that that would be a good focus for me. Also, there was the connection of family. So I had a lot of connections in the province of Hubei, and you probably know Wuhan. Wuhan has kind of leapt into the imagination of everyone now as the place of origin for the COVID pandemic. But this period of time that I was in Hubei was in 2019, which was the year before the pandemic emerged. Part of the reason that I chose Hubei was family, but also because as I looked at a lot of the religious traditions in Hubei province, they hadn't received as much attention for people who were publishing in English. So I thought, even though there are some things that are available to read, there's kind of a lack. So I took that as a point of departure for focusing on Hubei province. So religious studies, so as I mentioned, when I was an undergrad, I had some really good teachers, people that taught me how to read classical Chinese, taught me about literature, and also about religious studies. So a lot of that layer of interest has been there since I first started my schooling, so back in 1986. So I saw that as like a continuous thread, and I wanted to pull that out a little bit more by doing research on divination. Another thing that affected my choice for this topic was that as I was teaching in the honors program, I was teaching a seminar on the real and the unreal. And as we were exploring a lot of films and texts, I saw that my students were really interested in trying to sort out things that were real or unreal, seen and unseen. So a lot of that kind of held my attention, and I see the interest in my students. I wanted to explore that a little bit more for myself. And then also, I think contributing to my interest was looking at the ways that narratives are constructed. And I mentioned these films. Some of them you might be familiar with: Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, Old Boy. These are films that we watched in class, and one essential component in these texts is the idea of what's called the long con, meaning that there's something that is being put forward as a plan in order to achieve some particular goal, but it takes a long time to get there. It's called the long con. And I started to think about that. So in an cross-cultural setting, what happens when you tell a story that's in a long con? So I was looking at that in film, and I thought, well, what happens in a Chinese setting when you're looking at this idea of the long con? And then I went into looking at specific vocabulary words, and there's one that's a very interesting phrase here. It's called huyo. And huyo sometimes is translated as hoodwinking, or pulling a fast one on somebody. And that really kind of caught my attention, because another thing that I've done at SIUE is I've led a lot of travel study, bringing students to China. And we would go to Beijing, we would go to Shanghai, we go to Xiamen. And oftentimes during our tours of students, we would go to temples, and we would happen upon fortune tellers that would arrange themselves at the entrances of these temples, or sometimes in very crowded places, sometimes in like the walkways where you go underneath the highway or over a highway. Positioned there would be a fortune teller, a diviner, who would sit there. And they'd have these little stools, and you would go up to them, and they would start to tell your fortune. And you realize that you're kind of in this you're being played in a way. There's this kind of sense of a con that's going on. So I thought, I want to investigate that. So that had an impact in me choosing this topic of divination, the long con aspect of it. The other thing that immediately I thought of in terms of divination, as there's the rise of social media in China, a lot of the things that were done on the street immediately get put into the smartphone app environment. Same is true for fortune telling. So as you're onto WeChat, which is the dominant social media platform in China, there are all these accounts where you can go and have your fortune read inside those apps. So I thought about that in the kind of role that technology has in kind of pushing traditional culture into a different sphere, different area. So those are some of the roots of why I chose this particular topic. This is the sabbatical line of inquiry. So as I put together my proposal, I really had like a wide kind of area that I was interested in. I wanted to create an inventory of the different types of divination that you could find in Hubei province. And so I looked at the main areas in Hubei, both in terms of kind of urban environments, as well as sacred mountains, or types of sacred space like temples, as places where I could go and look at how was divination being utilized within those contexts, and thinking about how these can be analyzed in kind of a market for divination experts. So that was my initial line of inquiry. This is just kind of like a little bit quicker summary. But I have to say that for a lot of research that goes on, when you do your proposal, you have all these ideas, and often they're very theoretical, and you read a lot, you develop a bibliography, you pull together all your sources, and then you put your plan together. It's approved by, being vetted through your colleagues, giving you suggestions on how to fine-tune it, make it better. But then when you're on the ground in country, a lot of other things happen. And I wanted to share a little bit about that. So, I had to make adjustments. So as I was there, I started to realize that because of that social media platform, a lot of the methods that you would pay people by were controlled by WeChat. So here you have a situation where, as I was moving around inside Hubei, whether it was in an urban space or sometimes even in the countryside, as I encountered these diviners or fortune tellers, a lot of them did not have smartphones. They were completely unplugged. They were in almost in a different century, so to speak. And I wondered if there was things about that particular transition that was having a huge impact on the divining practice. One of the things that I found really interesting as I brought students to China, oftentimes we would have a presentation by someone who was a liaison between the State Department and the Chamber of Commerce. He would come and talk to our students, many of whom were from the School of Business, and he would do a presentation. He did this for years, from about 2005 all the way to about 2012. And each year the presentation would be, China is big, fast, and complex. And that was true. And then when I got there in 2019, or even when I look at it today, it's even bigger, it's faster, and it's even more complex. So I think that that's an important component to any kind of research, is recognizing how complex and how fast it is changing. So I thought about that in terms of these divination experts being kind of pushed to the side while this AI algorithm is running, predicting the future. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But what that did is it kind of like made me rethink my initial area of inquiry. The other thing that had an impact was that it increased public surveillance in China. So as you are in the world moving around, particularly as a foreigner, you stand out a lot, but there's also this aspect of public surveillance that's going on that can be detrimental to those who are doing fortune telling or doing divining, depending on the kind of local attitude towards that, local government attitude towards that. Is it something that is, they turn a blind eye to, or do they round those people up and say, you know what, you want to go back to your countryside and you don't want to do these types of things here? So there was that kind of level of management of these divination experts, I found, through this additional surveillance level. So is it becoming more scarce? Are those services more private in nature? And then this is a big one here, which is, as a foreigner doing research in China, what are the obstacles there? Obviously, there are a lot of things related to, are people willing to talk to an outsider, to talk to a foreigner? What kind of information will they give you? How do you use that in your research? That was something I had to really think about and adjust. But there's also kind of deeper reflection that I thought was interesting, and this is more recent about this particular topic, is that there's this very deep underworld of divination that is both textual and a kind of oral performance arena of culture. And it's very, very complex. And the more I started to explore it, the deeper that vein went. And the other thing is being managed by those people as you're doing your research, being managed by family, by academics, by writers, and then a whole host of other types of people who do divination that are in these side fields, some of which seem to be very sketchy at times. So when you go and you talk with someone who says that they're a faith healer or a shaman, or that they're a trance medium, or they're I Ching master, charm writers, healers, these types of people, I started to realize that with that massive kind of culture of divination practices, fortune-telling practices, in a sense, I opened up something that was much larger than I was able to even start to understand. Another obstacle was the local dialect. So I speak fluent Mandarin Chinese, which is a standard dialect. But when you get out into the countryside, particularly in areas around in Hubei, central China, the dialect can change. But also because of the people's profession that has a different choice of vocabulary, and then with the dialect on top of it, it can be very difficult. So sometimes I would have two translators, one who was there as my handler, who was usually from the party, but then there was another one which was a local handler, which was someone who helped me translate from the local dialect. But I kind of came to the conclusion that in order to do this type of research, I really needed to focus down, drill down on more specifics. So I decided to move into an area which was much more narrow. And so my outcome really was a specific study about a temple in an urban setting in the city of Wuhan. And what I did is I looked at a kind of it's a Buddhist temple. They have a process of fortune telling that's done through your movement inside of a hall that is full of bodhisattvas. Each bodhisattva has a number, and as you move through them, there's a certain formula where you land on a particular bodhisattva, you get that number, and then you go to a window and they give you a charm that says, this is your fortune. That's the kind of system that was in place. So I'll show you a couple pictures of that. These are some pictures that kind of show in a temple format the kinds of fortune telling that are available. A lot of them include charms that you can bring with you, put on your person. I don't know if anyone recognizes this here. This is really popular in China. This is from the movie Roma. And this is something that you can see in malls and all over. But actually this is at a sacred mountain, Wudangshan, which is in the western part of Hubei province. So you climb the mountain, it takes like 7 or 8 hours to get to the top of the mountain. And there I am thinking like, oh, I want to go and talk with the divination experts at the top of the mountain, get the word. And they look at me and say, we can't do your fortune because you're a foreigner. Didn't work. But I could put in my dollar here and get this to read. But just to give you a sense of the temple, this is INTS. And there's what's called the Luohan Hall. In China, there's roughly 4 or 5 of these things that are pretty large in their scope. You can tell from some of the pictures. This is what it looks like when you're inside that particular hall. So this is a vast temple complex with many different parts of the temple. It's a monastery, a place where monks live, but then also this hall is arranged with all of these lohan inside. This is where you count your steps according to your age, and then you find yourself in front of one of them, and you get a fortune. Just to move through this more quickly, this is the fortune that I received, and this kind of goes back to my translation strength. This is the fortune that was given to me, which is very, how would you say, ambiguous. So I think I'll end it there. Any questions?
I have two. So my understanding is like the Dalai Lama is chosen when they find a child that they think qualifies, and he picks out a toy.
Ritual object.
Ritual object, yeah. That a previous Dalai Lama had. So I couldn't help but notice kind of a similarity between the way they do fortunes with the bodhisattvas, where, well, you grab this one, this is your fortune. Did you see any kind of connection with that yourself, or?
I think all of these are systems. The systems, and as I became more knowledgeable about divination systems, is that it's a very rich kind of area, and it really depends on your training, your background, what tradition are practicing. Are you Buddhist? Are you Taoist? Or some amalgamation of both. In China, you have some of that going on, where people will borrow from different types of traditions. You also have the I Ching, which is one of the foundational texts for divination in Chinese culture, and there's a lot of schools for how to interpret that. So there's a lot of variety of ways of navigating these different types of systems.
I guess the second question is less, or second is less of a question, more of an observation. But the ambiguity of the fortune.
Yeah, I mean that's a
Kind
little bit
of.
like Julio or.
Right. It's kind of it's kind of similar to astrology and other forms of kind of predictive fate type stuff, where it's kind of pseudoscientific in nature. It's kind of fun, but it's really interesting to look at that from kind of a pluralistic point of view, I guess is a way to say it, where you can kind of draw that similarity between that sort of practice across all kinds of cultures.
Yeah, there's a human element there, universal. Other questions?
I wanted to ask you, are these remnants of an older culture before Mao and the
Definitely.
cultural, cleansing of the population? Did they really survive, or they are
Yes.
rediscovered and reinvented?
Well, they're always being reinvented and being recycled. But there are so many traditions of divination, and I mean, I'll give you an example. There was a woman that I was told was actually someone who received her ability to read a fortune through bees. That's not in any text, really. I mean, maybe there's a folk tale about that, but this was someone who actually would help people heal and do some types of predictive consultation through communication with bees. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is like, what are those things that are become part of the institutional culture, which the I Ching is a classic text that was memorized and passed down for generation after generation after generation. And even though you have in the modern period a reassessment of the traditional and putting that to the side, there's still widespread investigation of that particular text that is ongoing. People writing commentaries about that all the time.
In Romania, for example, the gypsies are considered, remnants of an Indian population that immigrated from India in different waves through medieval times and so on and so forth, and they were fixated because the gypsies in Romania for 100 years or 200 years were fixed to the property of noblemen, so they were kind of slaves. So in the population, there was maintained a kind of a belief that they were very good with divination or with doing witchcraft, especially women. And after the fall of communism, it kind of boomed again, and you could see women accepting to be filmed and say, I am Baba this and that, and my strength comes from this lake. And that's why I know how to tell the future, to guess what is good for you, or to see what aches you and what illness is in your body.
Yeah, I think in China there's a similar type of resonance between locale, geographical or geological formations, natural phenomena, and those that are sensitive to those types of information.